So the country was in the tank when it came to the economy. Where the United States is going through the Great Depression, and we saw how Hoover has dealt with the problem, not very well. So Americans are going to start looking for a change. They start obviously blaming Hoover for everything, and so they're going to want to change. And that change is going to come in the form of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And we enter into a time period in the Great Depression, also known as the New Deal era, when FDR comes in and tries to do the exact opposite of what Hoover had been doing. Remember, Hoover was more geared towards business. That was his philosophy. Business brought America into greatness. Business will bring America out of the Great Depression. Well, those things weren't working, and Hoover was limited by his philosophy. So Americans are going to want to change in philosophy to see if that's going to work to bring them out of the Great Depression. And we'll see how that works, whether that actually works or not, or if whether it's just a different way of dealing with the same problem and the problem still remains the same. We'll see as we go forward. So the New Deal era is a new way of trying to deal with the Great Depression throughout the 30s and into the 1940s. That brings us to the election of 1932, where the Democrats put up Franklin Delano Roosevelt and the Republicans actually renominate Herbert Hoover. So let's take a look at both of these guys and see what's going on. Now, FDR was the fifth cousin to TR, and he was very much like TR in a lot of ways. He was an aristocrat as well, obviously the Roosevelt family being incredibly wealthy, and that's generational type wealth. And much like TR, he was an only child of these wealthy Roosevelts. And he grew up on a very impressive estate there in New York. His life was very much one of wealth and privilege. He had a private education. He went to Harvard. He went to Columbia Law School, much like TR did. However, he didn't finish law school exactly like TR didn't either. So he soon even married a distant cousin, Eleanor Roosevelt. And she didn't even have to change her last name. So yeah, get your E's out of the way. And an interesting thing, Teddy Roosevelt actually walked Eleanor Roosevelt down the aisle at their wedding. Eleanor apparently hated her father, and TR was a much closer relative, friends-wise or mentor-wise to the two of them. And so TR actually walked Eleanor down the aisle at their wedding. FDR had served in the New York legislature. We saw him earlier running for vice president. Right, but the big difference between TR and FDR was that FDR was a Democrat. Right? So, now, he still had the same types of ideology as TR in some degree, people being responsible, but power is good, but it has to be used correctly, things like that. We also have to remember about FDR that at age 39, in 1921, he was hit with a disease called polio, which is an infant paralysis disease. Usually, if you make it past 4, 5, 6 years old, you're kind of out of the window of polio. And he got hit with it when he was 39 years old. So this big, man is hit with a disease that usually affects very small children. And it affects the way he looks at the rest of his life after this. And it changes him in his outlook on people, on wealth, on government, and things like that. So he had everything going for him, and then this kind of gets wedged in there for him, and this was a big driving factor for him. So what happens is going into the presidential election of 1932, the Democrats were in a position where they could almost not lose, much like the Republicans in 1920. The Republicans almost stood no chance of winning here in 1932. Again, the Democrats probably could have run a scarecrow, and the scarecrow probably would have won. Well, they nominated FDR, who at that time was governor of New York. And was nominated, he gave a speech accepting the nomination, and this is part of what he said. He said, I pledge to you, I pledge to myself a new deal for the American people. And that's much like what Teddy Roosevelt did. Remember, Teddy had the square deal, and now FDR has a new deal. So essentially saying this is a new deal from what TR did, right? Because TR had his square deal, and that kind of went bad, or we kind of forgot about it. So here's the new deal for you, right? Now the Republicans renominated Hoover. Why? I don't know. Maybe they just knew they were going to lose, so maybe they just kind of sat him up there, or maybe they figured, well, he is the sitting president. Maybe we try to give him another chance to really, turn this around. He's already come up with the refinancing corporation and all that stuff. So maybe we give him another shot. Well, Hoover went around saying that, if you elected a Democrat, businesses would fail, grass would grow in the streets, weeds would take over the farms, all that kind of stuff. And people really thought, hey, old Herbie, that's already happening there, man. Like, well, it can't get any worse, so you're not really helping us out. You can even see his campaign slogan there on the button, play safe with Hoover. Like, what? Okay. It's not really inspiring either, right? So when the election comes around, that's a pretty big beat 'em down there on that one. FDR wins fairly easily, as you can tell. The Solid South is definitely Democrat, and then the rest of the country essentially went Democrat. In fact, Hoover only won a few states. Even though he didn't win 40% of the vote, he only won 11% of the Electoral College. So, FDR becomes president, and in March of 1933, when he takes office, he makes a couple of promises. This is what he's going to promise here when he takes office in March of 1933. He's going to promise three things to America to get them going again, to give them a new sense of hope going into the Depression and how to deal with the Depression. So he says the first thing that he's going to do is he promised that the government would provide direct federal relief to people. All right? So direct federal relief. Remember, Hoover was more about that indirect. Giving to businesses, giving to charities, showing them how to do their money better, but he never gave money to individuals because he thought, that would injure their spirit, injure the way Americans thought, and so that was his philosophy. Well, FDR said, no, we're going to change that. We're going to go the exact opposite. We're going to give direct relief to people. Second thing he said is he talked about a plan to control agricultural production due to what he believed was their overproduction. He thought that farmers were producing too much food and that was a problem and that agriculture needed to get that under control. And maybe thinking, that seems odd. If everybody's kind of starving in the streets, then why is he saying that agriculture is overproducing? Well, he's right and he's wrong. The overproduction, if you remember, caused something that we know as the Dust Bowl. And the Dust Bowl is going on right now. And the Dust Bowl is what leads to a lot of farmers having to abandon their farms or move or what have you because of their farming practices. However, the policies that FDR are going to put forth don't address that issue. They just deal with the yield that the farmers are getting, not the actual cause of the problem. So that's why we say yes and no, that may seem like a problem, it may not. Then the third thing, he talked about a plan to get industry back on its feet. Okay, to get factories running again, to get workers working in the factories again. So he's basically talking about industrial recovery on a wide scale. So those are the three things he's going to promise here in his inauguration here in 1933. The direct relief, curb agricultural production, and get industry back on its feet, get it to recover. Okay. And when we talk about FDR and the New Deal, even to this day, there are extreme views about FDR and about the New Deal. Some people view FDR pretty much as the savior of the United States. Many households had pictures of FDR on the walls. To people in labor unions in this country, you would have thought that FDR had created labor unions himself. And so people with a more liberal point of view, it was the highest point of their lives at this point. This is what they wanted. They want the government to get involved and take care of everyone and everybody be okay with this, right? And they want government involved in everything and every aspect of people's lives. So he was a savior. To other people, FDR was an apocalyptic destroyer. He led the country into too much overspending, too much government welfare, too much regulation of the economy. He destroyed enterprise, destroyed initiative, and destroyed America. To some, at the very best, FDR was a fool. To others, he was a crook and a moron. There were lots of people that couldn't even say his name. Instead, they referred to him as that man. Ooh, man. In fact, at one point, I had a student who was from New York, and their grandmother, still into the 2000s, referred to FDR as that man. As that man, because she had lived through it. She was fairly old at that point. But in her household, they had always referred to him as that man. That's how much they hated FDR, to the point where even her grandson knew who that man was whenever she mentioned it. So it's either extreme love for FDR or extreme hatred for FDR. And these viewpoints get really exaggerated over time. And you know, it depends on what party you affiliate with, depends on what kind of views you have. And so what we're going to do is kind of look at it, what happened. Not really try to look at it through a political spectrum, but let's look at the problem and see what the result was. Okay? And I'll let you decide if that was a good thing, a bad thing, kind of a meh thing, or whatever. All right? So at least he's trying something. Let's put it that way. You know, Hoover tried his one way, that didn't work. Okay, so now let's try another way, see what happens there. All right, so FDR's purpose with trying to do this or trying at least this new approach, was to save representative democracy in this country. Because what was going on in the world at this point, here in the 30s? No, it wasn't socialism. Well, not quite, right? It's more fascism and dictatorships. FDR wanted to save representative democracy because he was afraid that America may fall into fascism or a dictatorship. Right? So TR had his socialism. FDR was worried about European-style fascism. Right? So, and FDR's trying to maintain some welfare for people. He didn't want to see people digging through the trash. Not like Hoover did. And that's not like Hoover was sitting there going like, yes, dig through the trash. Yes. But his means weren't working, at least in the short term. So let's try something else. See if that works. All right. So this is what he wants to, he's essentially going to place his policies into something known as the 3 R's. And just about every New Deal policy or program dealt with one of these 3 R's. And those 3 R's are relief, recovery, reform. All right? Relief, recovery, reform. Those are the 3 R's of the New Deal. Okay? So relief. So what did he mean by relief? Relief was for the unemployed, the hungry, the homeless. Okay? So try to get them some aid, try to help them out. Make sure that they're not suffering as much as they had been before. Okay, what does recovery mean? Recovery means get those people working again, get those people fed again, maybe find those people homes, those type of things. So get them back on their feet. Recovery. All right. Then reform. Reform is to change the processes so that it won't happen again, that these types of things won't happen again, at least on this scale and in the fashion that it happened, right? He actually kind of sounds like TR in that sense, right? When TR was doing his progressive things and saying, well, we don't want this and this and this to happen. Of course, in some instances, TR turned into the thing he hated, but that's what he's trying to do. Remember, he's very much influenced by what TR did, all right? So, and Hoover had tried to do some of the same things, but FDR was able to make people believe that they were going to survive it and make it through the Depression. All right? He instilled confidence, whereas Hoover instilled confidence in business, and when they saw it fail and they blamed business, and then obviously they blamed Hoover, they couldn't get their confidence from Hoover again. So FDR is the one who provides that confidence, saying, well, I have this different way. Let's try it. People are like, okay, it's better than what Hoover could have done. So that's why it instills confidence in people. All right? So you say all these things, but he's got to back it up. He's got to get his 3 R's rolling here. And so whenever he takes office, he really hits the ground running. In his first 100 days, he realizes we have to get moving. This is an urgent matter. If you've ever wondered why now we look at presidents in their first 100 days, like what have they done in their first 100 days? And you may be thinking, why does first 100 days matter when they're going to be president for at least 4 years? I mean, the first 100 days of 4 years seems kind of irrelevant or kind of arbitrary. The reason why we look at it in that sense is because of what FDR was able to accomplish because he was dealing with such a big economic crisis. So let's see what he does here when he first takes office. The first thing FDR did after being inaugurated, he was actually inaugurated on a Saturday. So on Sunday, he enacted a week-long banking holiday to begin that following Monday. So all banks were to close their doors on Monday by order of the federal government. You may be thinking, how does he have the power to do that? He had the power to do it actually under an old World War I law that Wilson had enacted. So he calls Congress into special session to work on the banking crisis. That's the main thing that he wants to focus on to begin with. And so he calls them in to talk about this banking crisis. So they start meeting. Congress finally gets all there and everything by Thursday of that week, and they immediately start working on this banking crisis. But think about this. So for all that week, the banks are closed. You can't get any of your money out. I mean, it had been estimated that Americans had taken $1 billion out of the banks. That those that could get to the banks before, they went broke and didn't have any more money. And they had stuck all those $1 billion in their, walls and coffee cans and what have you. So, what do you think people did? They went back to bartering. They went back to bartering and trading. Like, hey, I see you have 3 apples. I have 3 oranges. You want to trade? I mean, stuff like that. People still bartered. It's not like the economy just quit. Just people started going back to trading. This is what happened. So for that week, people were bartering back and forth, trying to get the things that they needed because banks weren't open and nobody was using their money. Kind of crazy. So what happens is when they get in there and they start talking, the piece of legislation they come up with is known as the Emergency Banking Act. All right, and what the Emergency Banking Act did is the first thing that the government would do was go out and inspect all the banks. Every single bank that was in America would be inspected by the national government. They would begin in the big cities, and so they would go to the big banks in the big cities, work their way through the big cities, and then working their way down out to the small rural banks. Government inspectors would go out and take a look at the conditions of every single bank. The banks that were strong enough to be saved would then be given governmental loans to help strengthen them. Those that could not be saved were liquidated. What we mean by that is everything was sold. Everything. Even the building, the light fixtures, the toilets, whatever. Whatever could be sold in the building, including the building itself, was sold and liquidated. And then the proceeds of the sale of that bank went to go equally pay everyone that had an account in that bank. So essentially, you're going to be getting pennies on the dollar, but I guess it's better than what you would have gotten, which was nothing. So this bill was introduced into Congress, and Congress met at noon that day. And how long do you think it took for them to do this? How long does it take a normal bill to go through? To go through Congress and then end up on the president's desk to sign it. Takes a long time, right? It could take weeks to months for that to happen. Well, this one went into Congress at noon. It was on the president's desk by 9 p.m. that night. And they didn't take any shortcuts either. They went through the entire legislative process in 9 hours, which makes you wonder, if they could do this in 9 hours, why aren't they doing everything else in 9 hours or shorter, right? Like, why is everything else taking months? If they really set their mind to it, maybe they'd be more efficient. Anyway. So, in fact, whenever somebody was trying to stall in any part of Congress, they would roll up newspapers to represent the bill and then start like smacking people with it while they were debating, and people would rise up to debate a particular issue, and then they would get beaten down with the not beaten down, but you know what I mean, like people would wrap their newspapers on the whatever they could and start yelling, vote, 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 vote. So it was crazy. It was crazy times, right, going on. So how much influence do you think FDR has at this point? He has a lot. You think he could have pushed through a lot of radical legislation? Maybe, because people just wanted to get stuff done. But he didn't, at least not radical in any sort of revolutionary type sense. So the bill passed on that Thursday, whenever they finally got on. They passed that Thursday, and the inspectors were ready to go the following week. So the banks aren't ready to open. They're not going to be ready to open until Monday, all right? So the following Monday. But this bill isn't going to work unless what happens? What's got to happen? It's not going to work unless people believe it'll work. So which means what? They have to bring their money back. They have to actually start putting their money back into banks, even though the banks had just hosed them 4 years previous. So they have to think, well, okay, I'm going to believe in this system. I'm going to believe it's going to work. Well, do you think the people all over the country really know what's going on at this point and what this bill really says? No. So how are they going to know? How are they going to know what to do? This is how. On that Sunday night before the banks were going to open on that Monday, FDR went on national radio, all right, and made a national radio address. And he explained to the American people what they were doing and what it was intended to do and how this bill was going to work. At least how it was written, it was going to work, and this is what we're going to do. This is how we're going to build the banking system back up. And a lot of people, we have written accounts that people really thought that it felt like he was just sitting in their living room explaining to them what the future of America was going to be with this banking process. And it worked. It totally worked. Banks started to open on Monday, and there was a couple of runs on the banks because people were not entirely sure what was going on. But most people did. A lot of people actually started to bring some of their money from, beneath their mattress or in their coffee cans or whatever, and started bringing it back to the banks for deposit. So it's actually starting to work. You're not just having this drain of money out of the banks. People are starting to invest back into the banks. So it's a start. In fact, his radio address is the beginnings of FDR's usually weekly chats on radio called the Fireside Chats. And he had numerous fireside chats where he would essentially talk to the American people by the fireplace in the White House and talk to them about the issues of the day and what have you. So it worked with the banking crisis, and so any other major issues, he would have a fireside chat with Roosevelt and talk to the American people over the radio. Okay, so they get that going, right? Then what they have happen is a couple of other banking acts, namely the Glass-Steagall Act, and then the introduction of the FDIC. All right, and these are banking reforms. All right, so these are banking reforms. That first Emergency Banking Act is more of that relief, right? The confidence type stuff, recovery type thing. Glass-Steagall Act and the FDIC is more of a reform measure. So what this did is the Glass-Steagall Act was proposed by two senators, Glass and Steagall. I know, very creative. And what essentially it does is it separates commercial banks from investment banks. And it split those two, right? So commercial banks could not invest in the stock market. Right? Commercial banks were there to give loans, to have savings accounts, to offer certificates of deposit, things like that. Right? Low risk, more community-based types of things where you're taking care of the people. Right? Investment banks were those banks that you could put your money in and hold your money in, but you knew that they were going to be taking maybe bigger risks by investing in the stock market, things of that nature, right? So this Glass-Steagall Act separated the two out. All right, and where is that coming from? That should be fairly obvious where this is coming from, right? So all those commercial banks investing people's money in the stock market with the buying on margin stuff, right? So they wanted to keep that separate because people didn't know that the banks were investing their money into the stock market through the buying on margin process. Why they didn't figure that out when enough people were doing it, I don't know. But they decide, okay, people should know what they're putting their money into. If you're putting it in a commercial bank, you're saying, this is what I want you to do with the money. I want you to make, low risk loans. I want you to offer certificates of deposit, things like that. If you put your money into an investment bank, you're essentially saying, okay, this is what I want you to do with my money. I want you to put it in the stock market. I want you to invest in technology or farming or what have you, right? So you knew what you were putting your money in depending on what type of bank it was. Right? Then the FDIC is short for the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation. All right? And what the FDIC does, what the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation does, is it's in the name. It insures deposits in banks on a federal level. All right? And again, this is obviously a reform. So this was a federal agency that all federal banks had to belong to, and many state banks actually joined the FDIC as well. What they do is they paid insurance premiums, and it provided insurance for individual deposits in the bank. Right? So this was there to maintain confidence in the bank. Now, originally, deposits were insured up to $5,000. All right? So if you had $5,000 in the bank, then you were insured up to that amount. But say you had $10,000 in the bank, and then the bank went kaput, right? Well, you were only insured up to $5,000. So you get that $5,000 back, but that extra $5,000, well, you lost it because you weren't insured for it, all right? So that initial amount, again, create confidence, like, well, if I at least have $5,000 in there or less, I'll get my money back from the federal government. Of course, now the FDIC insurance goes all the way up to $250,000, and it very recently was $100,000. I'm sure it'll continue to go up as we move along, right? But right now it's sitting at around $250,000. So those of you that have bank accounts with over $250,000 in it, you might want to try to spread your money around banks or around bank accounts. Otherwise, if everything goes horribly wrong, you won't be able to be insured for it. I know, you're all sitting there swimming in money. So, just good, sound financial advice there from Dr. Smith. Go and spread that money around, right? Maybe put it into my retirement account, please. So, anyway, now what happens here is that, again, this isn't an overnight type thing. It's there to build confidence, right? It's a confidence builder. It's trying to change the nature of how private banks are working to make people more confident in it, to get everything back on its feet. Okay, but it's a reform measure to instill that confidence, all right? Then, okay, so he's finished with the banking stuff, at least for right now. Now FDR goes after the financial markets. All right, so he wants to reform the financial markets. So in 1933, Congress passed a measure entitled the Truth in Securities Act. What this called for was corporation that issued stock to the public, they had to give a full and fair disclosure of their conditions. Okay, what we mean by that is, who is their CEO? Like, what are they trading in? What have they bought? What have they sold? What assets do they have? What assets have they sold? What kind of employees do they have? What kind of pension plans do they have? Anything that could affect the way you invest in that corporation had to be known. All right, they had to be known, and you had to be transparent with what you were doing, because what that does is it allows people to understand the companies that they are investing in and that they're buying their stock in. Now, if you're a private company, you didn't have to do that. But if you're a private company, you're also not on the stock exchange either. But if you're on the stock exchange, you're a publicly traded company, and therefore the public should know what they're getting into. All right? And you may be thinking, okay, that's pretty easy. We don't really have that problem anymore. But we still do. We still have this problem. One of the bigger, more recent or more modern examples of this would be Enron, the Enron situation. Now, those of you that are old enough to remember Enron and would think, man, that wasn't that long ago, but Enron was. And those of you that are too young to know what Enron is, you may be thinking, what the hell is Enron? Well, Enron's not around anymore because they lied to the public and to their employees about their conditions. And essentially, a lot of upper management of Enron was embezzling money not only from their investors but also their employees, and taking the employees' pension funds and things like that, retirement accounts, and making bad investments or gambling, literal gambling with it, till they finally got caught in their shell game with it, and the entire company collapsed. Numerous people lost their jobs. People who had worked at Enron for decades had no retirement savings, and some of the CEOs of Enron went to jail. Some of them are still in jail, and many of them actually committed suicide from it. So it was all in all a bad thing because they had violated the Truth in Securities Act. So it's still a thing that is still around and is still put forth today, and people still try to get around the act as well, even though it would seem, fairly common sense. If you want to be a successful business, you would do this, right? So it at least allows people to hopefully know what they're investing in. Another thing that they did to reform the financial markets was the Securities Exchange Act, which set up the Securities and Exchange Commission, otherwise known as the SEC, not the sports conference, not the college sports conference, but the Securities and Exchange Commission. Right? Now, what the SEC does is this is federal regulation of the stock markets. All right? And some of the main reasons for the creation of the SEC, the Securities and Exchange Commission, was to regulate the stock market and prevent corporate abuses relating to the offering and sale of securities and corporate reporting of bonds, all those types of things, right? Any sort of financial tool that can be used is regulated by the SEC. The SEC was also given power to license and regulate stock exchanges. They were also there to license and regulate the companies who traded stocks on those stock exchanges. And they were also there to license and regulate brokers and dealers who conducted all the trading. So anybody who was on any sort of stock exchange had to be licensed and regulated by the SEC. Now, there was some enforcement authority given by Congress to the SEC that allows the SEC to bring civil enforcement actions against individuals or companies alleged to have committed accounting fraud, providing false information, or engaged in insider trading or any other violations of the law, right? Now, these are civil things that the SEC can do. Essentially, they're going after them for fines or to pull their license, things like that. Obviously, you may be thinking, well, some of that sounds criminal or can be criminal. And you're right, it can be criminal. But the SEC cannot bring criminal charges against an individual or a corporation. Instead, they have to go to the Department of Justice with their information and their evidence, and the SEC works alongside with the Department of Justice, and the Department of Justice is the one who brings any sort of criminal charges against an individual or corporation for violating these laws. And then, of course, the SEC helps the Department of Justice through that whole process, right? And here's an even funnier thing. The first commissioner of the SEC was Joseph Kennedy. It was Joseph Kennedy. Joseph Kennedy was the first commissioner of the SEC. Now you may be thinking, wait, what? Isn't he the guy who kind of sort of started this? Like, well, who knows better how to manipulate and abuse the stock market than the guy who manipulated the stock market that caused the crash to begin with? Right? If he's smart enough to figure all these things out, maybe he's also smart enough to keep other people from doing it. Right? And we've seen that before with, the Interstate Commerce Commission and the railroad people and all this kind of stuff. But the thing is that by all accounts, Joseph Kennedy took his job very seriously. He was able to flip that switch and say, yeah, I was on the other side of this for a long time. That's how I made a lot of money. I may have ties to the mob, maybe, whatever, I don't know. But I will take this job seriously. And he did. He apparently took it very seriously, and apparently he's actually one of the better SEC commissioners that we have had, because he knew the ins and outs of the stock markets and of the people and of the corporations, and he was able to keep everything in check. So there are people who can do that, who will do that will take the job seriously, even though they're on the other side of it. Obviously, there's other people that aren't and just kind of play a lot of cronyism. But there are also people who do take their job seriously, even if they've been on the other side of things. So those are the types of things that FDR was doing with the banking system and with the financial markets. The New Deal also had to deal with the unemployed. So what are we going to do about the unemployed? How are we going to relieve them and help them recover and reform the systems that will help these people? Remember, anywhere from 25 to 33% of the people in the workforce were unemployed during this time. So something needed to be done in a hurry, according to FDR. And the New Deal employed all kinds of actions, and we're going to talk about a few of them here. There was a lot more than what we're going to be talking about, but we're going to talk about some general programs and some of the bigger programs to kind of illustrate some of the actual ideas that he's having to try to help these unemployed people. So first, the very first thing that he tried to do was he believed that there had to be some emergency relief. That, people are starving in the streets, they're fighting each other over garbage. So he gets Congress to pass the Federal Emergency Relief Act in 1933, otherwise known as FERA, F-E-R-A, FERA. All right, now we're also, to just give you a warning, we're getting into a time in all of these policies that we affectionately call alphabet soup, where everything has all of these letters and initials and all these types of things, right, in their names. So all these programs are going to be known by their initialisms or their abbreviations or things like that. So try to keep them all straight, because I will refer to them interchangeably as their full name, like Federal Emergency Relief Act, or I'll also refer to it as FERA. It's just the way it is. It's just the way we all talk about these things. So what FERA does is it appropriated about $500 million and gave it to the states to hand out to the unemployed. All right, just to literally hand it out. Like, here is money. Here you go. Here is cash. All right. This type of name of this type of relief at the time was called the dole, D-O-L-E. Like you're doling out money. The government is doling out money. So it's called the dole. The dole is where you just line people up. The state would just line people up at these places and just say, here, 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 here. So and this is a great deal more complicated than what I'm making it. We're trying to be broad here, all right? But essentially, Congress just took this huge chunk of money and gave it to the states, and then they gave it out. Well, this isn't very American, is it? In America, we have that work ethic, don't we? We have that work ethic dating back all the way to Massachusetts and the Puritans and even the farmers in the cotton plantations and tobacco plantations. I mean, everything. We have this work ethic going on, right? So you have to work for what you get. We even have this in American society now, in modern America. You work for what you get. Well, they immediately began looking for other methods to provide relief to Americans because so many people, including those that were getting the money, were complaining about the nature of this program. In fact, it was very shameful to be on the dole, because that's what you were considered, on the dole, if you were going and getting this money. It was very shameful. Had a colleague whose mother at one point was on the dole, and he always said it was a great point of shame for her and her family when she was growing up to be on the dole, because they weren't working and they were using the money of other people's hard work to live, and being on the dole was just something that you didn't brag about. You didn't walk out of getting your dole money going, "Hey, I got my money, woo, let's go to the bar." Like you didn't do that, right? So, and people were complaining, and as you can see, it doesn't last for very long. People are trying to find a different way to help people, but FDR was like, well, this is pretty direct, and this is about as direct as I can get. It's just to say, here's money. Here you go. Here's money. Obviously the exact opposite of Hoover, but it didn't really sit well with Americans, even though it was something different than what Hoover was doing. Then we have the Civilian Conservation Corps. And what the Civilian Conservation Corps was a place for young men aged 18 to 25, 30, a chance to go into what was essentially the American military. So what you would do is you would leave home and live into what amounts to a military camp where they clothed you and fed you, and what you would do, what kind of work you would do, is right there in the title. Conservation projects. You would do conservation projects. So they would pay you a tiny amount of money, something like $1 a day for the month, so about $30 a month. And most of that money was sent home to their families, because they were like, well, I'm being clothed and fed here while I'm doing this work, and they're taking care of me here. I'll send what little I have, and I'll send it back home. And so these young men would work on projects like building roads through national parks, establishing national parks, clearing out brush, and all these things to make these places nice, do game control on the lands, anything like that. Build the cabins, build visitor centers, those type of things, right? So it was there as a conservation project. They did other things too. The CCC had camps all over the country to do this type of thing. And it lasted from 1933 until about 1941. Of course, in 1941 and going into 1942, the United States had something better for its young men to do, like go fight Hitler, right? So once World War II starts, that marked the end of the Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC. However, about 2.5 million young American men were involved at one point or another in the CCC. So it provided some relief, it provided some work, but instead of just handing money out, those people got money, they got food, and the country as a whole was able to benefit from it. If you've ever been to a national park, you have probably seen something along the lines of this road was built by the CCC, or this bridge was built by the CCC, or this area was cleared out, what have you. If you ever go to any of those national parks, you will see something from the CCC more than likely, because they were all over the country. So at least that was seen as, we're getting something out of it, we're putting these people to work, and it seems mutually beneficial. So it's much better than that than the FARA stuff, right? So it seems like they may be on a good track for something here. Then something comes along known as the CWA, or the Civilian Works Administration. And the Civilian Works Administration was part of some of the most controversial relief that the New Deal engaged in. And that was something called work relief, right? Work relief. And the first work relief agency was the Civilian Works Administration. And it had a lot of money to hire people to do just about anything. And they basically made up anything for people to do just so you could hire them and pay them. But the problem was it doesn't on a whole create things that have a long-lasting value for a community or a state or the country or what have you. It was things that needed to be done every day, kind of everyday things like clean school playgrounds or rake leaves or dig ditches, things like that, right? And so people would hire these people to do these things because so many people were unemployed and they needed the money out there quickly, right? But the reason you may be thinking, well, that doesn't seem so controversial. We need those things done. It may not be the most glamorous thing. It may not be working out in the woods, working on national parks. But, I mean, we need school playgrounds cleaned. We need leaves raked. We need ditches dug. What's so bad about it? Well, the reason why it was controversial is the way they did it. Because they would have, say for example, they would have certain people come in on Monday and Wednesday to rake leaves. And then another group come in on Tuesday and Thursday and rake leaves. Well, they would be raking the same leaves. The Monday group would come in and rake the leaves to one side of an area. Then the Tuesday people would come in and rake the leaves back to the other side. Then on Wednesday, they would come in and rake it again, back the first way. And then the Thursday group again would come back and rake it back to where they had it. So the leaves are just every day are just switching sides of the yard, essentially, right? They would hire people to come in and dig a ditch, and then hire people to come in to fill in the ditch. I mean, that's odd. Like, well, it's because it's just trying to get people to work to do something. The reason why it got so much criticism, obviously you're not getting anything out of it, and it seems like a waste. But this is what they were also doing in the Soviet Union. There's a great example of in the Soviet Union to kind of illustrate this, where there was a truck factory in Moscow. They would have all the parts for the trucks, and they would build up the trucks and have these perfectly working trucks, which then they would send by train across the continent to Siberia, to a factory in Siberia. The factory in Siberia would literally dismantle the entire truck. And then they would send all of the dismantled truck parts back to Moscow, where they would rebuild the truck. These trucks never saw the road, ever. They only saw the insides of factories when they were being built and when they were being dismantled. But the Russians were saying, hey, we have full employment and everybody's getting paid, right? But nothing was being created, and it was creating a poor country there for the Soviet Union. So people saw this and saw what was going on in the Soviet Union. They're like, oh my gosh, this is awful. We can't do this. We'll end up being poor and all, like even poorer than what we are right now. So it didn't last very long, right? So they were trying to save that American work ethic by not just handing stuff out on the dole, but they were going about it, and a lot of people thought, in a very weird and very wrong way. So the CWA got so much criticism that it was ended in the spring of 1934. So it only lasted for about a year or so, maybe a little over a year, before they decided, okay, this work relief, we can't do it this way. We have to figure out a different way to do it, to where we save the American work ethic and not do something like this. But keep this type of work relief in mind, because we aren't going to see the end of it. It'll come up here again. Now FDR tried to reform things in agriculture and industry. He's gotten the unemployed, he has gotten the banking and financial markets. Now he goes after industry and agriculture. So what did we say was farming's basic problem when FDR took office, or what he believed the main problem was? Overproduction. Now wait a minute, there were Americans who are hungry and poorly clothed and starved, all this kind of stuff. Yeah. So did we have an overproduction problem? It depends on how you look at it. All right, it depends on how you look at it. So what we're talking about here is to try to understand, well, how do we have an overproduction problem, or how is it seen as an overproduction problem when people are hungry? And the way that FDR looked at the problem was correct but incorrect. The major problem with the overproduction at this point in time was the way farmers farmed. Okay, we've mentioned it earlier in the lecture, but the Dust Bowl, correct? Where everything went to shit, essentially, with the farming, and nobody could grow crops because all these massive dust storms were happening all throughout the Midwest that was choking out plants, choking out animals, choking out people, and it was very hard to live, hard to farm. And the reason for that is because of the farming techniques used by the farmers there in the Midwest for a very long time. Something that they did not use was what we call crop rotation, and hopefully you've heard of what crop rotation is. It's essentially you rotate crops around at different plots of land if you're a farmer, because it allows the soil to breathe, it allows it to rest, it allows it to replenish its nutrients, things like that. As even in places where they grow mainly one thing, like in Nebraska with corn or Kansas with wheat, they still do a form of crop rotation where it allows the topsoil to stay, because that's what you really need, is the topsoil that has all the nutrients to stay in there, and it'll nourish the crops and you'll get good crops from it. So there's different ways to do it, but we're trying to be basic here, right? Well, the farmers had just kept growing and growing and growing and growing, and all of that topsoil is not staying put because it's getting tired, it's not having as many nutrients in it, and eventually, when winds come along, they're not rooted, the soil is not rooted in anything, and it blows away. When it blows away, then you get all of the plants that can't grow as well, and it leads to this vicious cycle. And so all of those dust storms are created by all this topsoil being blown away because there's nothing there to hold it in place because of the way they've been farming. Again, we're trying to be simple here in our explanation. So it allows all the crops to die. You have all those horrible things that happen with the Dust Bowl and these massive migrations westward to find better farmland and all this kind of stuff, right? If you've ever read The Grapes of Wrath, you know what I'm talking about, because that's what it's talking about, these Oklahomans in the Dust Bowl moving west to try to find work. I feel sorry for you if you've read The Grapes of Wrath. If you have not read The Grapes of Wrath, consider yourself lucky. I'm sure some of you are like, I love The Grapes of Wrath, but oh my gosh, that book. Ugh. It was terrible. And the ending is just ridiculous. The ending is weird and ridiculous. Even if you've never read The Grapes of Wrath, just go read the last 2 pages and you'll see what I'm talking about. Anyway, I digress. So that was the real problem. But what FDR and the government thinks is a problem is that they had overproduced and therefore saturated the market with their food. All right? And what's the main point of being a farmer? What's your point of being a farmer? You may be sitting there going, produce food? No. The farmer's main job is to make money to provide for his family, to make a profit so he can provide for his family, not to grow food, right, for everybody else. His main purpose is to provide for his family. Well, when you've produced too much, the demand for it, right, drives down price, right? We've all seen that, hopefully, in economics where, oh, well, the price is just too low, so therefore they can't make money because they've overproduced this amount of food, right? So you see the difference between what actual overproduction is causing and what FDR's government believes is the problem with overproduction. It's two very different things, isn't it? So what they do is they come up with something known as the Agricultural Adjustment Act, otherwise known as the AAA or the AAA. All right? And what the Agricultural Adjustment Act did was provide for crop and market limitations on key agricultural products such as cotton, wheat, corn, etc. And what it did is it called for paying farmers to limit production on these crops. Okay? It was to be voluntarily done with the assistance of the federal government. So farmers were to work out how they were going to limit their own production. Okay? So a farmer could say, I'm not going to produce at all. I'm going to produce 0%, or I'm only going to produce 50%, or 10%, or 80%, or however they wanted to do it. They individually decided what they wanted to do, and then the government would pay them for what they didn't do. All right? So, where do you suppose the money came from to pay for these benefits? Like, the money's just not coming out of air. You have to pay the farmers. So where's the money coming from to pay the farmers to keep them from farming? Well, the money is coming from added taxes and tariffs on things, right? The money to pay this is coming from taxes on processors of these farm products. Things like mills, packing houses, stuff like that. The things that take those raw materials, like that wheat, corn, cotton, what have you, and turns it into a final product. All right? So the processors, the middle guys in this process, you tax them because they're the ones who are benefiting from the farmer's labor. All right? Okay. So what is this going to do to the American populace? All right, what's this going to do? Because many people in America are suffering. So how is this all going to work? Okay, well, if you limit production, what is that going to do to the price? It's going to make it go up, right? It's going to make it go up. Well, that's going to help the farmer. According to the AAA, this is going to help the farmer because they'll be making more money. They'll be making more money. Oh, see, we've limited supply, so the price will go up, and you'll make more money, and now you won't be so poor anymore. Then, what are you going to do with so the prices are going to go up, so American consumers are going to pay more for it to pay for the farmer. Then the higher taxes on the middle guys. Do you think they just absorbed that and said, well, it's for the good of the country? No, of course not. What are they going to do to that price hike on them? Right, they're going to pass it on to the consumer. Right? Those guys never pay anything like that. They just say, okay, well, we'll just tack it on to the price of what we're selling. So what has just happened to the American people here? What has just happened? So if prices have gone up because farmers have limited the supply, and businesses are going to pass on the cost of the taxes to the public, you're essentially taxing the public and raise the price. So you've hit them with a double shot of higher prices. Higher prices from the limiting the produce and higher prices from the taxes. So do you think people could afford food before? No. So do you think they're going to be able to do it when you get this kind of price increase on the food? Probably not. And on top of this, any of the produced surplus that was sitting in grain silos or whatever, you know what they did with that stuff? What do you think they did with that surplus food that they had already done that was sitting there waiting to be consumed? What do you think they did with it? Maybe thinking, well, they probably gave it out to charity, or they went to, homeless places or something like that, and they got rid of the food. You would be wrong. The Agricultural Adjustment Act and those who enforced it ordered all of that food surplus to either rot or be burned. They burned food when people are fighting over garbage. They burned food. How insane does that sound? I should hope it sounds incredibly insane. So, not only do the Americans get hit with this upshot in prices when they really couldn't afford food anyway, now if they can afford less food, is that going to make the farmers more money? No. Is it going to make the mill workers and the plant workers that process that, is that going to make them any more money? No. So it actually probably made things worse. It probably made things worse. It made the farm depression even worse because now even less people can afford the amount of food that they want to eat, which means that the farmers aren't being paid and the middle people aren't being paid either. So everybody goes down with the ship of the Agricultural Adjustment Act, right? I don't want to shock you, but sometimes the government thinks they're doing right things and it ends up going horrifically wrong. The only saving grace for the FDR administration on the Agricultural Adjustment Act is just a few years later in 1935, the Supreme Court rules it unconstitutional, and we'll get to that here in a second. But they rule it unconstitutional, say you can't do this, this is not within the purview of the federal government, and FDR is kind of like, oh, thank God, okay, the Supreme Court kind of saved me from that one, all right? So it was eventually ruled unconstitutional and it went away. But they did try a second one. They tried a second Agricultural Adjustment Act, which we thankfully won't talk about. But they tried it again, and it didn't have quite the disastrous results as this one, but it didn't help much out either. Okay, so that's what they tried to do with agriculture. Let's see what they did with industry. All right, so something had to be done about industry. And there was a major measure for industrial recovery called the National Industrial Recovery Act, or NIRA. All right? And NIRA was administered by the National Recovery Administration, or the NRA. Not the National Rifle Association, but the National Recovery Administration. All right? The National Recovery Administration was kind of over all of this industrial recovery. Okay? So what NIRA tried to do was they tried to plan for the entirety of the American industrial economy. And their definition of industry was incredibly wide-ranging, anywhere from dog food to making broom handles to restaurants to even burlesque was considered an industry. Now, some of you are giggling saying burlesque, and some of you are going, the hell's burlesque? Look it up. Look up what burlesque is. Those of you that already know what it is, you can giggle silently to yourself, or maybe out loud, whatever you want to do. But those of you who don't know what burlesque is, go look it up. But they considered that an industry as well. So essentially everything is an industry. All right? So this is what NIRA tried to do. Okay? So it did a couple of things here. So I'm going to list off the things that it tried to do, and then we'll go from there. So these are some of the things that NIRA tried to do. All right. So it tried to limit deflationary practices, tried to I talk for a living, tried to raise prices and wages, tried to establish a minimum wage, to eliminate child labor, and instigated a 40-hour work week. Okay? In addition, NIRA also tried to get collective bargaining. And what that means is that workers could work together to negotiate their deals together with their industries, okay, as opposed to working in there as individuals, okay? And NIRA passed the Congress. The problem is that the way the enforcement of NIRA worked, because they made about 550 different codes for all of the industries, okay? And what I mean by codes is a set of laws, all right, or a set of rules. And they had over 550 of these rules and laws. Do you think Congress is going to be able to administer all 550 of these at once? No. Do you think the National Recovery Administration is going to be able to do this all at once? No, it's not. It's way too much, way too much. And one of the bad things is that they did not consult business. They did not consult much of the way of industry when they did these things. And industry insiders of all of these industries would have said, this would have been much better if you had actually consulted us and we could have helped you write some of these rules that we could follow, because some of the things you're asking for is just insane. And we can't do this. We can't do this. We can't do this. This doesn't even match our industry. This doesn't match industry standards here. Those type of things, right? But people tried to buy into it. People really did try to buy into it, even with all of its flaws. They tried to build confidence in American industrial production and investment. You can see even from those pictures there on the sides, you know, restaurants saying, hey, we're part of trying to do what the NRA is trying to do. We're trying to make everything better. You can see their slogan, we do our part. Okay, we're trying. We're trying, right? But NYRA experienced its fair share of difficulties. One of the major negative aspects of NYRA was concerning the minimum wage, because there had never been a minimum wage before, ever. The market had always decided what somebody's wage was going to be based off their skill set, off of who they were, who they knew, what have you, right? The market had always set a wage, but now this established a minimum wage. And where they found that this was a problem was across the country, obviously, namely in the South. Many white business owners got rid of their black employees and then paid their white employees the minimum wage. All right, because they didn't want to pay the black employees the same amount as the white employees. But now they said, oh, well, this is all I have to pay you? Oh, okay, well, all you white workers, before that you were making well more than this per hour. I only have to pay you this. So this is what I'm going to pay you. So all of you are getting salary reductions or hourly wage reductions. And all you black employees, see ya. Because I don't want to pay you as much as them, but I want to pay them the minimum. Right? So you can say it's racism, you can say it's greed, you can say it's both. Right? But everybody got screwed by the minimum wage being put in, because it artificially dealt with the wages and screwed with the market, and it caused a lot of problems. A lot of people lost their jobs and their homes because they couldn't afford it anymore, one way or the other. Okay? So NYRA was actually considered, once it actually got put into place and people were trying to do their part, and everybody's kind of looking around going, this is awful. And it was really widely considered a policy failure, even in the 30s, and by historians today. It was considered a good idea, but just poorly executed. Amongst these types of things that they tried to do, it just really wasn't working out for them, right? And again, in 1935, the Supreme Court ruled that NYRA was unconstitutional, so it kind of wiped it off the books anyway. But some of those ideas were around to stay, like trying to get rid of child labor, trying to have a minimum wage, things like that, the 40-hour work week. Okay, if you've ever wondered where do we get the 40-hour work week, it seems pretty arbitrary. It's because it is. It's arbitrary, right? So, but some of those ideas stick around, and we'll see them later. But put it all in together in the NYRA, it was seen as a policy failure and unconstitutional, obviously, by the Supreme Court much later. So, but at least they're trying to get confidence back into industry. They'll figure it out. They'll figure it out. Then the last thing that we'll talk about with the first New Deal is something known as the Tennessee Valley Authority, or the TVA. And this is probably one of the most radical proposals of the New Deal. The Tennessee River Valley, which you can see there on the map in the green area there, right? A lot of Tennessee, parts of Alabama, parts of Georgia into Virginia, a little bit of West Virginia, that area. That Tennessee River Valley was one of the most poverty-stricken areas in the United States in the 1930s. This is one of the poorest areas in the 1930s. To make matters worse, it was subject to periodic flooding that washed out the area on a regular basis. In fact, at the time, there was no real inland transportation within that area because all the roads would get washed out, that most people just used boats and used the rivers and their tributaries to get around because roads were kind of useless at that point. And because of that, they also did not have electricity on a wide scale there in the Tennessee River Valley. Only about 1 in 50 families had electricity in the Tennessee River Valley. Not 1 in 50 people, 1 in 50 families had this. I don't know if you realize this or know this, but electricity makes your life a lot better. Electricity is pretty awesome. So they want to try to figure out a way to get these people some electricity. And that's what the Tennessee Valley Authority is going to try to do in 1933. It's a government agency given public money, taxpayer money, to build a series of dams on the Tennessee River and its tributaries. So it's a public project to do this. So it does two things for us, right? It would do two things. One, all the dams will stop the flooding. That's nice. So not everything can be washed out. Maybe we can build some roads. Hey, all right. We don't have to worry about drowning all the time. That's great. Another thing is, what else can a dam do? It can provide hydroelectric power, can it? It can provide electricity. And what they did is that the Tennessee Valley Authority built these hydroelectric dams and then started building an electric grid. And they started to sell electricity to these people, and electricity becomes much more widely available to those people of the Tennessee Valley. So, when the government gets involved in this, what do you think the costs of electricity does in the area? It doesn't go up, it goes down. It goes down. The government's involved, and there's more people having it, so there's more supply of it, which drives the price down. So people got electricity in their homes and no more flooding, and you're thinking, why was this so radical? Why is this so controversial? Well, this is a government agency that is using taxpayer dollars to get into the market and start selling things at a much lower price, and the government is the one who owns all of this. They've used people's money to own this stuff, and it's selling it in competition with private companies. That sounds like socialism. That's the beginnings of socialism, is when the government starts to own the means of production and starts to get rid of business or to lowball business. And people are like, whoa, wait a second. The government should be helping private business do this stuff. The government shouldn't be running out private business. That sounds a lot like socialism, and there was a lot of controversy over it. But the Tennessee Valley Authority remains, even to this day, doing the things that they're doing. And we have other things, like other river authorities. But a lot of these other river authorities are more private companies and things like that run the rivers and provide these types of things too. So it depends on where you live and what river you're on, and if they have a river authority and all this kind of stuff, and then whether it's government run or privately run. But people are like, this really stinks of socialism. And FDR even said, well, I don't know if this is fishy or not, but it tastes pretty good to the people of the Tennessee Valley, so we're going to kind of keep it. And it did, but they never tried it anywhere else. FDR never tried the TVA anywhere else. But as you can see there's a more modern picture of the Tennessee Valley area, and you can see they have roads. Hey, that's nice, and they have dams and all that kind of stuff. So it's still there. It's still in operation today, but there's no other New Deal policy of this magnitude that is tried ever again. So, okay, so now we're at the end of the first New Deal, and obviously there's going to be some opposition to the New Deal. We've already talked about opposition to the different programs, but what about opposition to it as a whole? And as a generalization, critics of the New Deal were in two different camps, right? Those that thought that the New Deal had done too much, and those that thought that the New Deal had done too little. I'm thinking, wow, that's kind of a big gap there, and it was. Those that were in the too much category said that there was too much government, too much interference in society, too much regulation, and too much spending. Just too much. There's too much of all this government interference, too much of them using public funds to do small things or this or that, not to help taxpayers, but to help other people. It's just they're telling us too much to do. Like, why isn't this more like the early 20s? Why does this seem more like the early teens instead? Right? So they just thought everything was doing too much. Then those who thought that it was doing too little, they critiqued the New Deal by saying, well, it's not doing enough for farmers, and it's not doing enough for minorities, and it's not doing enough for old people. Those people are being left out of the considerations of New Deal programs, and you're not doing enough for them. So either way you looked at it, people were disagreeing with the New Deal for obviously very different reasons, and they each have their own process. Can these things both exist? Can these types of complaints both exist at the same time? Are they mutually exclusive complaints? No, they're not, are they? You can think that the government is doing too much, and the government also didn't do enough for old people, right? And you could even, some people even held these views concurrently, saying, well, it spent too much money, but if they're going to spend this money, they didn't do enough for old people. Right? So it got very complicated with a lot of people. And you can even see from the political cartoons there, you see the one side that says, well, it's just pumping money and everything's leaking out everywhere. And then the other one where you may be thinking, oh, that looks kind of nice. The kids are all dancing around FDR and all the different works there and everything. But what do you think they're singing? They're probably singing Ring Around the Rosie. And how does Ring Around the Rosie end? Hopefully you all know this nursery rhyme. If you don't, I feel sorry for you. All right? Ashes, ashes, we all fall down in a heap of ash, which is very morbid for a children's thing, but a lot of children's things are morbid anyway. But that's what they're saying. Like, they're either spending too much or those programs are all going to fail and turn to ash. Right? So he's getting it from all different sides. And so what he decides to do, he's like, wow, this first New Deal, I feel like it did a lot for some people. And maybe, I messed up in some areas. Some things are getting ruled unconstitutional. So maybe I should sit back and take a back seat and give it a year or two and see what's going on. So that's what he does. The first New Deal ends with all of their acts in 1933 and 34. And FDR takes a break from his reforming crusades and from the New Deal to assess the first New Deal and to decide what he's going to do next. After FDR took that year or so off, he decides to come up with the second New Deal starting in 1935. And this is going to be a revamped version of the first New Deal, where he's going to try to correct the wrongs of the first New Deal, try to make it better, and he listened to the concerns of those who thought it had done too much and those that had done too little. He's going to try to find a good middle ground and see what he can come up with here. So if you remember, what form of relief did we talk about where you would make up work and you would pay people to do it? It's kind of there. I already answered work relief, remember? Remember how I said it was so criticized last time? Yeah. Well, in 1935, the New Deal leadership created a massive piece of work relief legislation known as the Works Progress Administration, or the WPA. The WPA was work relief on a much longer lasting scale from 1935 until World War II. And it averaged about 2 million people working for it every month. The fundamental idea of it was that if private enterprise couldn't give a reasonable number of American people something to do, that the government would, even if they had to make it up. However, they were going to make up this work and have it be a long-lasting thing that the American people could actually get something out of. So the WPA did all sorts of things. For example, they built sidewalks in a lot of areas. In fact, if you walk in a lot of areas of downtown, wherever you live, you will probably find WPA stamps on something, or governmental buildings. If you go by, say, the old post office, or your town hall, or the county seat of a place, or whatever, like any of those older type buildings were probably built by the WPA, and you can go and find a WPA stamp on some of them, right? So the WPA also employed things like teachers and musicians and artisans and other skilled workers to put their skills to work. And that way, education lasts a lifetime. So you hire teachers to teach people that, different skills. You hire artists to create art, because art is very important to culture. Musicians, same thing. Music is very important to the human experience, right? So, for example, the federal government hired teachers to write travel guides. Another thing that for Texans, what they did is they hired teachers and historians to go out and find people who had been slaves and interview them about slavery and their time in Texas. And we actually get a great resource out of it called the Texas Slave Narratives, which was about 10 volumes worth of research. And one of the major areas that anybody researching slavery in Texas goes and looks at, because it was such a valuable resource. So it's fairly important. It's fairly important, the things that they're doing. It's long lasting, but it was essentially, well, what are we going to do with these historians? Or what are we going to do with these teachers? Or what are we going to do with these musicians or artists or whatever? But let's at least get something lasting out of it, as opposed to just them having raking leaves from one side or another, or filling in and digging ditches, things like that. So you pay them, you got something worthwhile of it, but it may have been not necessarily pressing needs either, right? The next thing that FDR tries to do was way, way more than what he had done before, and that was the Social Security Act of 1935. And FDR said that to him, this was the most important thing that the New Deal accomplished. And the Social Security Act did a couple of things for us, but essentially it created a system of old age payments. Don't say it's insurance, because that's not what it is. It's old age payments. In fact, we even hear it referred to as Social Security Insurance now, or SSI now. It's not insurance. It's not insurance. Not insurance. It is old age payments. It's essentially the current workforce is paying the older generation to stay out of the workforce so they can have jobs. That, again, that's a generalization, but that's what it's there for. It's not an insurance program. All right? Even though it's labeled as such and most people think it's an insurance thing, it is a system of old age payments. All right, so Social Security means that you work and you pay those that have retired to stay retired. All right, so it's a transfer of payment system. It's controversial then, it's obviously controversial now. Some people say it's going broke. Some people say that the government is stealing money from it blind and not repaying it, and the American people don't know where the money is. All this kind of stuff, right? I'll let you figure out how you feel about Social Security one way or the other. But this is just the facts of the Social Security Act. So, by law, the money that goes into Social Security is invested in U.S. securities. So all of that Social Security money is being invested into the national debt. All right, so that's where a lot of the money goes towards, is being invested in the national debt. So, the government, again, is trying to do something to take care of the elderly. Right? Remember, that was one of the things he was criticized for. You didn't do enough for old people. You didn't do enough for the elderly. Well, now he's trying to do something for the elderly, not only now, but in the future. And because eventually is expanded to take care of everyone, which was outside of its original purview, but that's where it went. Right? So the younger generations are paying for the older generations. And it wouldn't be so bad if every generation was slightly bigger than the previous generation. But as we know, that doesn't always happen. You can see that with current generations, with the baby boomers being so large, and then their children, that's a much smaller generation. And then each generation after that has been a little bit smaller. And so you have a couple of generations after a huge generation that are smaller, and it creates burdens there. If all of these have been progressively bigger than one another, the system works fine. But it caused problems then, and it causes problems now. Some people say it was great then, some people say it's great now. Some people say it was awful then, some people say it's awful now. But one thing we do know is that it wasn't meant to be a national ID for anyone, and it also wasn't really meant to last a long time. It was supposed to be a Great Depression measure that hopefully eventually was phased out, and obviously neither one of those things have happened. So, but to FDR, this was one of the most important things he did because it was a way to try to keep people from being poor again, especially the elderly who were hit very hard by the Depression, keep them from being homeless or having to rely on their families so much by giving them a means of income that they could rely on, right? Well, he's passing all of these Second New Deal policies, and they definitely seem larger than the other ones. He's also taking into consideration a lot of the criticism that he received in the first New Deal. But what really matters here is that after Roosevelt began this Second New Deal, he begins to run into trouble with the Supreme Court. And so he ends up having a political battle with the Supreme Court. And the overall reason is actually pretty simple. Because what had happened in 1935 and probably in 1936, we've talked about, the Supreme Court was overturning some of these New Deal legislation and ruling it unconstitutional. All right? You know, I mean, and FDR probably really didn't care that he was losing the AAA or NYRA or anything like that. But what he was really afraid of was losing Social Security and that being ruled unconstitutional. All right? Now, of course, how long are Supreme Court justices nominated for? For life or until they step down. All right, so they're there till they're dead, or they're there till they step down. They cannot be. They can be impeached, but I don't believe it's ever happened. All right. Well, this is the kind of how it broke down here for FDR, and he felt like he was being attacked by the Supreme Court with these things being ruled unconstitutional. So Roosevelt said that he's going to attack the Supreme Court back. And so what happened is that Roosevelt introduced something known as the Judiciary Reorganization Bill in 1937. Now, what this bill said was that, and this gets kind of confusing, so I'll explain it real slow and then I'll explain it again. It says for every justice on the Supreme Court who had reached the age of 70 and did not retire, the president could appoint an additional justice up to a total of 6. Okay. Okay. I know that sounds. So, let me say that again. For every Supreme Court justice that had reached the age of 70 and did not retire, the president could appoint an additional justice, not a replacement, but an additional justice up to a total of 6. Okay. Does that make sense? Maybe you'll see how this works. Now I want you to take your best guess here. How many judges do you suppose were on the bench at the time in 1937 that were 70 or older? 6! 6! Oh, what a coincidence! What a coincidence! Right? I mean, just so happened that the Judicial Reorganization Bill said that he could appoint up to 6 justices for every justice 70 or older. And there just so happens to be 6 justices who are 70 or older in 1937. Wow. Wow, what a funny how that works. Funny how that works. That's incredible. That's incredible. What a coincidence. Well, what's he essentially asking Congress to do? What's Roosevelt asking the Congress to do? To appoint 6 new justices. To appoint 6 new justices. To make it go from 9 to 15. 15. Do you think he's going to appoint guys that disagree with him or are going to be politically neutral or anything like that? No. He's going to appoint Democratic liberals who agree with all of this New Deal legislation, whether it's constitutional or not. That's what he wants. He wants them all to believe that it's constitutional, even when the other justices thought that some of it wasn't. Well, this was called the court packing scheme. Right? And that should tell you it's a scheme. And like typically with schemes, it's usually used in a negative light. And it really scared a lot of people in this country, regardless of their political affiliation, whether they liked FDR or not. You don't want a president to run roughshod over the other branches. That's why we have checks and balances. And we're very keen on those checks and balances in our government. That's what makes it run. Yeah, you may think the U.S. government does this and that, but it's better than a lot of other places because we have checks and balances and not one branch can run so roughshod over any of the other ones. Right? And so this court packing scheme scared a lot of people, both FDR's opponents and those who had never even opposed his ideas before. And essentially people saw it as either he's throwing a temper tantrum because he's not getting what he wants, and he's going to try to get what he wants, even if that means running over the Constitution, Congress, and the Supreme Court. Or you can see even some people with that cartoon in the middle thought he's trying to become a dictator. Right? And that took it to the extreme the other ways. Wow, he's trying to become the dictator and get what he wants and just have a bunch of yes men at all levels. And the people that started to turn on him here, obviously his opponents were going to be against him anyway, and those in the middle that were like, whoa, wait a second. But he even lost a lot of Southern Democrats because of this. Because the Southern Democrats didn't like this mode. They were like, well, if they're ruling these things unconstitutional, make the laws better. Don't just try to force your way into it. So he lost even a lot of his own party when he tried to do this. Right? So it was seen as a big overreach of power by FDR. All right, so let's look at the immediate results of the New Deal and the long-term results of the New Deal. Well, what was the immediate result of the New Deal? Did it get the United States out of the Depression? No. It kind of helped America limp through it. The Depression didn't get any worse, but it really didn't get much better. In 1939, the United States is still in a major depression. Unemployment is still in the 25 to 30% range. It would be the spending involved in World War II that got the United States out of the Depression. The massive spending on the war machine is what does the trick and what kickstarts the economy in the late 40s going into the 1950s. But if you think about it, it is a big accomplishment not to have everything go worse, and at least it got the American people through the 30s as a decade. I mean, the entire 30s as a whole is one massive depression. So for an entire decade, for it to at least level off, and because it could have gotten worse, but it didn't. Now, obviously, it didn't get much better, but at least it reached its bottom point and just stayed consistent. At least people could get used to something like that, right? So, was FDR able to preserve representative government? Yes. Did he at least try to protect the people? Yes. Did he try to prevent it from happening again? Yes. Are things like this going to happen again? Who knows? You look at 2008 and the things, there, and then we kind of do a little mini New Deal with after 2008 where we try to do reforms to make sure that thing doesn't happen again. So kind of sets a precedent that if we do go into any sort of type of serious recession or depression, we try to look at the problem and try to make sure it doesn't happen again. And that kind of leads us into the long-term results of the New Deal. And the long-term results are a mixed bag, and it obviously depends on your point of view on these types of things. In the United States, the New Deal kind of made the United States more of a welfare state than we were before. What's one of the main things that creates the welfare state? Social Security, We still have it, obviously, and it's still there. And there's been additions to it like Medicare and Medicaid. And it all depends on your point of view about what the government should do, how it should go about doing things, and what government's main function is supposed to be. Again, that's for you to decide. So, other New Deal projects kind of fell away. Some of them stayed around, but most kind of faded into history. And if you think about it one way or another, the New Deal created an idea that we were all in this together and that different entities should be concerned with different welfares of people or not. Whether private business should be involved with, individuals, whether government should try to make sure that old people are taken care of, all right? It did help redo the banking system and help solidify the banking system, which obviously has been some good things and also had its bad things as well. So overall, the whole feel of the New Deal is mixed, and its results were mixed. But at least it was different than what Hoover and the Republicans have been trying to do. Now FDR and the Democrats try to come in and do something different. Some things were successful, some things weren't. But what all this does is it shapes the United States and gives them a mindset of what's to come in the 1940s, and obviously with the beginning of World War II.